Hello and welcome to the first episode of season 2 of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. So I embarked on this project last fall as an idea to start interviewing super interesting people about super interesting things for what I hope will be a super interesting new book that I'm going to spend the next year writing. And I did about 42 of these interviews over the course of the fall. And I'm going to start off today. And I can't think of a better person to start off with about telling stories than my dear friend, Jeff Lemberg. Now, Jeff has spent his career telling people stories. He started off as a journalist. He's been a college professor. He's got a PhD in public communication and journalism from the University of Maryland. Go Terps. And he's embarked now
Fear
on
the
his
turtle.
third, fear the turtle. He has embarked on his third professional act. I love people who have new acts. That's also so much part of Wonder Hell and so much part of what makes us interesting. And he did this by leaving a tenured professorship. Nobody leaves a tenured professorship. So we want to hear all about that. He's launched a nonprofit that works in the education space. It's called Boys for the Better, and it teaches about healthy masculinity in a time when we have seen so much toxic masculinity. He's doing this to use media literacy to educate and help male identifying teens and preteens in Eastern Massachusetts, where he and I both live, to learn about healthy relationships, emotional wellness, and education and career goal setting. It is the thing that we need because it is so opposite from what we've been seeing for the last 10 and 20 years and the effects of which we are seeing absolutely right now. But also in late 2020, he joined the staff of Veterans Legal Services, which is located in Boston, and he's their first ever director of communications and development. Again, he's telling people stories. He's telling stories to people about other people. He's also the dad of 2 great daughters and the husband of another dear friend of mine, Maura. He drinks too much coffee, and he has consumed a truly obscene number of Oreos in 2020. I bet I could go Oreo to Oreo with you. How you doing,
Really?
Jeff?
I'm doing
Oh,
well. I would take that challenge.
now are they regular Oreos or are they like double stuffed? Because I'm a
Double
double
stuff.
stuffed kind of
Yeah,
girl.
yeah, double stuffing. Yeah. If you're going to talk smack, you better be in the double stuff arena.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you're out of your depth.
So you know how to tell a good story because it's like, it's outsized, right? I mean, so tell us, like, what makes a good story?
I think a good story, I think, has a narrative arc. I think you start somewhere, and ideally, you're wrapping it up to back to the beginning in some way. So you're taking people on a little bit of a journey. I think over the past year, people have really missed travel and journeys, and so books have probably been, and movies. We've done a ton of binge watching, as a lot of people have done. It's just a way to escape into some other world. And when there's surprise, and when there's emotional connection, and when you can finish where you generally started to some degree, and you see how things connect and how it relates to you, that's a good story to me. So how do you find yourself in something else? That's a good story.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody yesterday about how you tell stories of pain. And she was asking me, what happens when you get emotional when you tell a story? And I think this also maybe it may be more magnified for women, but I think men suffer from this as well. That question of when you get emotional, does that reflect on you or does that help bring people further into the story? And where in the evolution of yourself and dealing with the story are you able to tell the story better? I know Brene Brown it talks about telling the story from the scar and not the wound.
Yeah.
But still being able to talk about it in a way that's emotional for you, I think is really important. Maybe taking somebody down to the basement of where you're feeling, but like walking them back out also. And I think so many stories leave people down in the basement and then you're like, yep, and I'm fine. And they're like, wait, but I don't know how to get out. Like, where do I go now? The lights are off.
Yeah. And I think what you don't want to do, and you see this more in like TV news, for example, like when the emotion becomes so startling that it becomes about the person telling the story, and they're like, oh my God, are you okay? Like, what's wrong with you? And it's distracting from the story because, like, snot's drilling out of your nose.
Yes.
Then, that's where there's a general problem. But I think there needs to be more humanity in storytelling, where the storyteller is bearing more of themselves to some degree. And you see that, like, think about Van Jones, like when he was
Mm.
on CNN and he was talking about like what does the election mean, and he's just and he just broke down. And what made that news, one, he spoke so eloquently about why that moment was important in terms of Biden, winning the presidency. But the fact that he was so raw and allowed him to be raw, and the fact that he was a man who allowed himself to be that raw and challenged, societal expectations of the way a man is supposed to be. I think that's what made that a national story. Whereas if he just was very calm and cool about it all and just, said what he said, it would not have, gone out of that news cycle. So I do think sometimes a little snot can be good, and sometimes, just even like a normal amount of emotion brings people in because they're like, yeah, like this is something to be fired up about. This is something to be passionate about.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's weird to tell a story about an emotional time and not get emotional. One of the things that one of the first lessons I learned about public speaking, and as you know, I
mhm.
pre-COVID, spent a lot of time on stages,
Yeah,
is that you never want your audience to worry about you. Right. Like if they're worried about you, if you're okay, then they're not listening, they're not hearing your message and they're like, oh my God, is she all right? You
yeah,
don't want that to happen. You want them to know that you're in control. So I've thought a lot about this Van Jones thing, because he's incredible. He's so smart.
mm,
He was so eloquent in that moment, and I think he spoke for so many of us. I mean, I got emotional listening to him get emotional. But then
yeah,
I wondered how much of that is, he's an experienced talking head on television. He knew that there were two outcomes or three outcomes, I guess. Trump would win, Biden
yeah.
would win, or it would be unknown. And how much of it do you think he knew what he was going to say, and either one of
Mm.
those things, either of them, and any of the three of them might have been emotional for him, but how much of it do you think he already knew what he was going to say, and how much of it do you think was just hit him right there raw in that moment as somebody who's experienced watching people tell stories?
Yeah, I think it's probably both. Like most things, it's both. It's he had a sense of the moment and what he was going to say, but also as a father, as a man of color,
Mhm.
that I think all of it just kind of bubbles up. And you know, so I'm a progressive, as you are, and when Trump won 4 years ago, like I went into a hole. Like I had done some work for Hillary Clinton, New Hampshire, and I, was on a sabbatical at the time from my professorship. And so I used like a chunk of my time to go up to New Hampshire and work for her and Jean Shaheen to try to help. And when Trump won, like we literally picked up the kids and went to Rhode Island for like 5 days. We just was like, we're out of here. And we had like a media freeze, no TVs. We'd walk into the little hotel place and the TV was on. We're like, nope, nope, out of here. Grab your waffles. We're out of here. And we were like, literally like in a funk. Um, and the funk wasn't that Trump was president. The funk was that there were tens of millions of people who were willing to look past all of the awful things that he seemed to represent and say, and that you're willing to look past the way he treated women, willing to look past the way he talked about immigrants, way to look past the way he talked about people of color. That's what was horrifying to me.
Mhm.
And I think for a lot of people, and I don't know Van Jones, but I'm guessing like that's also a big part of it is like what type of country do we live in, and who are your neighbors, in the
Yes.
broad sense. And I think there's a degree of relief, even though there's still 70 plus million people in this country who, for whatever reason, wanted more of Donald Trump. Um, there's still at least the feelings that like, oh, at least we're in a better track here, that there's a majority of people in this country, to the scale of 9+ million people who reject that. That's the exhale to me. It's not like, woo, we got Joe Biden. It's the exhale
Yeah.
of like, wow, there's decency that has arisen in this country that has kind of put a stake in the ground to say like, this is what we stand for and what we won't tolerate. And so
Yes.
I think that's where the emotional outburst came from. At least that's where
Yeah.
I felt.
Yeah, I certainly felt that. I mean, I like you, I did a lot of work for Hillary, and it's there were two parts of the two moments in that campaign that I'll never forget. I remember sitting in at the convention center in Philadelphia when she came out in her white suit and accepted the nomination for president of the United States, the first woman ever, and I knew it was coming. I flew out there to be there. I worked for it for months. It was not a surprise that she received the nomination, and yet I sobbed like a baby in that audience. I was like a hot mess. Like my face, I was blubbering because it was such a like, I'm going to be 50 in a couple weeks, and I grew up with, Geraldine Ferraro was on the ticket when I was young and growing up. And yet I never thought I would see this moment. And I didn't realize how much I never thought I would see this moment until that moment happened. It
Mm,
was such an emotional release, as you say. It was just like I expected it, and yet the depth of my my joy, my relief, my anger, like all of it came out in that moment. And then I was in the Javits Center when she lost,
mhm,
when Trump won. And I remember just like looking around and looking at people of color, looking at young women, looking at LGBT people, like huddling together and crying, realizing that they only had each other. That was it.
mm,
Like they couldn't count on the rest of us. And the
yeah.
next morning I went to LaGuardia and I was walking through the airport, and it was like it was weird. It was like you could hear a pin drop. Like nobody knew quite what was going on. And I remember I couldn't make eye contact with men because I was like, God damn it, you did this. You did this. Like you are so such misogynist that you believed the worst rumors about her versus the worst facts about him. But yet I also couldn't make eye contact with the women because I was like, you did this too. There were so many of you, and I felt betrayed. It was such a
Yeah.
strange emotion. So I do think that when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won, it was like, ah, there's normalcy. And this morning, Joe Biden, his Instagram account has him posting, or whoever posts for him, a photo of him meeting with the top Republicans in the Oval
Mhm.
Office to talk about the COVID relief package. And he writes, "I had a frank conversation with
I read that in the
Republicans."
morning. Yeah, I
And
read that in
right,
the
and
paper.
where there are still issues to work through, but we are going to work together for all Americans. And I was like,
Yeah,
decency is back. Like,
yeah,
regardless of where you are, regardless of what side of the political aisle you on, you have to be happy that decency is back.
yeah, yeah, and that's just not a it's not a joke anymore, right?
Yep.
Like
Yes.
let's have people tune into policy making not for the entertainment value of it, but rather because it actually can improve the lives of people. And let's have that debate about what's the right way to go. But like, get away from this goofy reality TV show like um, Big Brother, like kind of like weird stuff. And so I think that for a lot of people, like to your point of like, where do other people fall in the spectrum
Mhm.
of like what they're willing to do? And that I think for is a lot of things, right? Like, and so on the plus side is um, that requires moving beyond the abstract of just like, are you voting for the blue or the red? And to understand that collectively as a society, like we make decisions. And so what happened in Georgia is a really nice thing that in
Yes.
the sense of like wherever you stand on it, and I've had some interesting debates with Republicans on this, was that, like collectively, it was a huge collective effort to get voter turnout and to engage people in the election. And that's wonderful. And so,
Yes.
like, shouldn't we just celebrate that? So the fact that, this person won versus that person, like the fact that more people are engaging in it, what horrifies me is, you read in the paper that across the country with redistricting and gerrymandering, and how do we like push more people out of the question, like out of the vote? Like, how do we limit access? That's horrifying to me, especially when
Horrifying.
it's coming out of a party that argues that they're all about freedom and liberty, but they want to make it harder for people to engage in the political process. You would think that everybody would want to engage as many people as humanly possible into the political process, and then have the political leaders work to engage the more they can, argue for the betterment of society and let the best
Yes.
idea win. But
Yes.
yeah, I think I'm
Yeah,
preaching to
you
the
would.
choir here too,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, look, I mean, I think, you would think absolutely, and you would think that having more participation is better than less participation, and yet if you're in power, really on either side, if you're in power, having more people speak up for the first time, they're usually people who are speaking up because they don't like who's in power. So, I mean, you can understand why redistricting and disenfranchisement and all of this happened. But I'm with you. I mean, I think, the more active, the better. Look, I mean, the only reason I know you is because I went to go work for Eli Siegel, because Bill Clinton talked about an idea of community service in exchange for college tuition, which was changing you while you help change the community, and more activity and being more involved in civic participation. So, you are definitely preaching to the choir. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about Boys for the Better, which is the nonprofit that you created, because I think so much of the toxic masculinity that we've seen has, gave rise to the sort of strong man of the Donald Trump era. And I think, I don't know if you created Boys for the Better in reaction to that, or just in reaction to general, boys being given just terrible media influences all this time. But let's talk a little bit about it. Tell us a little bit about Boys for the Better.
Sure. So created Boys for the Better 2 years ago, and it was absolutely born out of the Me Too movement, born out of Brett Kavanaugh hearings, born out of a couple of years of Donald Trump, and grab them by the bleep. And as a media studies professor, somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about and talking about the way that media influences people, sometimes directly, but always indirectly. And as a father of two daughters, and so my daughters now are almost 14 and 10 and a half, seeing just the amount of resources that are dedicated to them, which is great, but resources around empowerment and teaching them to fight back against systems and patriarchy and what have you. And there's just virtually nothing on the other side of the coin that helps deconstruct the problems that we're trying to help these girls fight against. So,
I've always been frustrated that the message that college freshmen get are like, don't get raped, when the message should be, hey, boys, don't rape women, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't know why we're putting the burden on the women.
Yeah. I mean, and to that point too, like you've seen in the pandemic, when some schools have said, well, we're going to be hard pressed to have a mask mandate. And then the girls in the school are like, wait a minute, there's a dress code mandate to us, because they're saying, like, if we show too much skin above our knee, like, we get sent home, but you're saying you can't require a mask.
Right.
And so there's all sorts of policies and programming aimed at girls, some good, some less good. But it seemed to me that there was a real lack of effort to engage boys as a way to prevent problems from happening, but also empowering them to be their best and most authentic selves. So I, at the time, as you said, was a professor. I was a full professor at Curry College, and I was unhappy. I think, at the time, I had been there for about 9 years, and which for me was a long time in any position. And, it became clear that the college just didn't have the structures or the systems or the resources that would enable me to do the things that I really thought needed to get done to help the college and to live the mission in service of students the way that, I thought it could. It wasn't allowing me to do the work that I really wanted to do. And then I thought, I'm a few years shy of 50, so you're the old lady compared to me.
You watch it now.
and I was like, wow, I have like 25 to 30 more years of work in me, and like the idea of being unhappy going to work seems ridiculous. But you fall into these traps, right? And you're getting paid well and really good benefits, and the schedule's amazing. And when you're a professor, you don't really have a boss, so to speak. So you're creating your own kind of fiefdom to some degree within the construct of the college. It allowed me to be the father that I wanted to be, which was my top priority of being around for my kids. So that was hard. And my wife, who's amazing, had been advocating, saying, if you're unhappy, like, quit, like, we will be fine, we'll figure it out, like, et cetera. So just super supportive. But it was really hard. And so I ended up having to have a conversation with my oldest daughter, Ellie. And I explained to her that I was thinking of leaving the college and to do something else. And what that else was, I wasn't sure at that time. But I wanted to know what she thought. And she asked, like, well, would you have to travel for a new job? Because she hates it when my wife has to go on work trips and whatever. And I was like, well, mommy has to do a fair amount of that. And so I would make sure that I would not, right? Because that's just the way it would be. And she thought about it and she's like, all right, you should quit. And so I asked why. She's like, well, you deserve to be happy. And, I started welling up and, she was like, are you crying? And I was like, yeah, like you see me as a person, like that's huge. Like, you're a little slug who just like, sees me as the person who takes care of her. But like, you see me as a person and you're like so beautiful and like amazing. And I needed that. Like, it's irrational that I needed permission from like a 12-year-old, but I needed like her to say like, it's okay, because to me, it felt selfish that I was in going this route. Like, it meant they were going to probably see me a little bit less, means I was going to have less flexibility. I was definitely going to get paid less. So we were going to need to tighten our belts a little bit. And so I felt like I was going to make other people around me have to struggle a little bit in the pursuit of my professional happiness. And to have that permission to go do that from the people that you love and who love you, that's what I needed. And that's what worked for me. So shortly thereafter, I notified the president of the college and the provost. Curry was a small place. And, I gave a full semester's notice. And over the course of that semester, I ended up developing Boys for the Better. And the idea is, let's use media literacy education as a topical hook to teach social emotional learning to male identifying students. As an educator, I think prevention is far more effective than intervention. And so we're going to go, as young as I can do so. And so we ended up settling around middle school. So grades 6 through 8. And it would be, figuring out the model and all that, but developed a curriculum, where we focused on healthy relationships, violence prevention, emotional well-being, body image, which is a big factor for a lot of boys, education and career planning, and thinking about what they might want to do and work towards. And a number of other things, substance abuse prevention, lots of other things. And the idea was, let's do this in schools. So rather than having it as ad hoc as an after-school program, let's go where the kids are. And so really work to embed this within health classes and within advisory periods. And so that was one big part of it. And the other second big part was, you need to engage parents and adult stakeholders. And so ended up developing talks and trainings for parents, coaches, guidance counselors, really helping a lot of the adults in these kids' lives understand media education and what kind of digital world these kids are inhabiting, so that the adults can talk to them in an informed way about the messages that these kids are receiving and how that shapes their sense of self, and more importantly, sometimes their sense of others. And then the last piece is program development. So we do some consulting work around program development for other organizations that care or are dedicated around youth services or male-specific programming. So that was kind of the 3 legs on the stool that we were working towards. And we made some really good headway, over the first year and a half. So.
Okay, so I want to talk a lot about that headway, but before we do, I have to ask. So you are married to a strong feminist. You're the father of 2 strong feminist daughters. I know that you are the son-in-law of a strong feminist. I know your family well enough to know that you're surrounded by a lot of strong women. But what about growing up? Was your mom strong? Was your dad a sort of a heart-centered type of dad? Did you have brothers, sisters? I mean, when did you come to this understanding of you yourself as a boy, as a man?
Yeah. I think I grew up in a pretty traditional household. It was the quiet dad who didn't emote much, stay-at-home mom by and large. Like, she was the true matriarch of the family, and like she was the center of the family. I have an older sister. And when did I see it? I don't know. I think, as a kid, I was frankly not all that different than I am now. You know, my head was a little smaller, so my ears were bigger, but otherwise, like, I'm the same. You know, like I was, you know, before like Obama made big ears cool, there was me. But you know, I was shy. I was a little bit more on the introverted side, and being a journalist was an amazing escape from that. Where like when you have a pen and paper in your hand, you can go talk to a stranger and ask them a gazillion questions. Like I was always really curious about the world, but would never really like just go to somebody that I didn't know. Um, you know, I tended to, while I had a lot of, you know, good guy friends, like for whatever reason, I always felt closer from a friendship standpoint with girls, where I felt like I didn't have to perform so much to try to, you know, be a certain way. I could just be myself and not really ever feel judged in any way. Um, you know, and at the time, I certainly didn't rationalize that. It just felt like, oh yeah, like I could go be friend, you know, I could be myself or more of myself with these people than that people. Um, so yeah, I don't know that I would ever at any point in my life been like, oh yeah, I'm a feminist and this is what I am. Like it was always just about like, how do you treat people decently? How do you like treat people with respect? Like that's the overarching kind of thing of anything that we did. And just a quick story. I was at my daughter's school about a year ago, in a parent-teacher meeting, talking to one of her teachers. And after we had the little parent-teacher meeting, she asked me what I did for a living because I was perhaps throwing out some education jargon. And I was like, oh, you know, I work with middle school boys and, you know, this program to explain Boys for the Better to her. She's like, oh, that's great. She's like, you know, I sometimes wish like I could just have a classroom full of boys and just teach the boys separate because, you know, they have all this boy energy and we force them to learn like girls. And, you know, I think that's so wrong. And I couldn't like not speak up against that because I just felt like that was so absurd. But the other hand, like, you know, we weren't there to discuss that, but I could not stop myself. And I was like, well, you know, I don't know that having a student respect the teacher and respect their classmates and respect the space and the environment is learning like a girl. And so I would argue that perhaps allowing boys to disrespect their classmates and the teacher and the space is giving them permission to disrespect a whole lot of other things in life. And so by giving them a free pass on this, I don't know that you're serving them well. And she was just like, whoa, like, she's like, all right, well, thank you so much for coming in. And, you know, I think she, you know, agreed generally, but it was just like, that, you know, these are the adults who are influencing the kids in many ways. And it reinforced to me the need for better conversations around gender stereotyping and around expectations. You know, when we do direct programming in schools, day one tends to be, you know, what does it mean to be a good man? And we kind of go through this exercise of, you know, manning up versus being a good man and et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, you know, at the end of the program, you know, I ask the same questions of what does it mean to be a good man? And then the kids always get there. And then they're like, it means the exact same thing as it means to be a good woman. Like it means basically to be a good person. It means to respect other people. It means seeing people for their humanity. I think that's the starting point. That's the end point. And I'd like to hope that, you know, throughout my life, that's kind of how I approached interactions with other people. So
That's such a great story. Uh, so as you know, I have two boys. They're 16 and 18, and my younger son is gay. I've met through the program you and I both are involved in, the Siegel Fellowship, Citizen Leader Fellowship program at Brandeis, that I've met a number of fellows who are gay, and they are growing up at a time where they've just always been out. They were just out their whole life because they've just, they live in a different place. It's more liberal. It's more socially accepted. They have role models on TV. It's just, there are more gay people in our living room now. So they were lucky enough to have this time that it wasn't that way when I was growing up. I mean, I, you know, like to say I didn't know any gay people in my high school, but obviously I did. I just didn't know, right? And some of them didn't know, but I didn't know because they couldn't come out. Like that was like the worst thing in the entire world. So when I had an inkling that my younger son was gay, and I really honestly, from the day he was handed to me in the hospital, I was like, "There's something different about that one than the first one. I don't quite know why." And by the time he was 3, I was like, "I think I know." And by the time he was 5, I was like, "Yep, I definitely know." So I sat down with one of these Siegel fellows, and I said, "Look, you seem so in love with who you are as a human, and you have a great relationship with your family, and I have to think that your parents did something right, or at least not really wrong. So can you tell me, because I think I need to start doing those things because I have this feeling that my son might be gay." And he gave me a whole bunch of things like, bake in lots of transitions so, your kid isn't like the soccer kid or the dancing kid or the science kid. Like, they can try on
Mhm.
different personalities and be lots of different people and give them an opportunity to, live in who they are, meet them where they are. Don't name it for them. Let them come to you. Like, just tons of great advice. And at the end of the coffee, I was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, that's so smart. That's so smart. That's yeah, yeah, got it, got it. I'm writing it all down." And at the end of the coffee, he's like, "Oh, and by the way, you should do this for your older son too." And I
That's
was
right.
like,
Yeah.
"Oh." So this like literally 22-year-old kid was basically
Mhm.
told me how to be a good parent, which is just this: treat your kid like a human. Right? And so it's
Yeah.
the same thing, like, don't raise boys, don't raise girls, like, raise humans. And so your story of, creating environments for boys because they're boys,
Yeah.
there's some, like, obviously brain development and things like that that go into it. I mean, boys and girls are different in some ways, but creating different expectations just because we've labeled them in a certain way, it seems crazy.
Yeah. And we know where we started this conversation around what makes for a good story. Like, you just told a great story because there was that punchline where there was a weight of like, what's the final point to this, which is like, and then this 21-year-old, said, treat, and that wraps back up to the beginning, which was like, let's treat everybody. So just,
Yeah.
it was a great little, micro example there of what
Look at
makes a
me,
great story.
professional speaker.
You just, you told a great story. It was a narrative. There was like some expectation of something to happen. You're waiting for something to happen. It was lovely. Um, yeah, I think it is incredibly important. And when you think about it through the prism of media, while there's tremendously more examples of media out there around like boys who are living their authentic selves, whatever that may look like, there's
Mhm,
still a gazillion examples of media out there where boys and men are acting in these stereotypical ways and they're being celebrated for that. And so, Boys for the Better, the idea was like, let's show them, like, we're going to use pop media. So we're going to use clips from YouTube. We're going to use, TV shows. We're going to use popular music. We're going to use video games. We're going to use ads, and have the boys look at the way that boys and men are stereotyped and the way girls are stereotyped and
mhm.
sexualized in the media in many ways as an object. And having them reflect on that thing out there and make sense of it. And then from there, it's a stage step where then we bring it into like, okay, like, how does this actually happen in your universe?
Mhm.
Namely like your school and your, social circles. And then from there, it's like, okay, how does this reflect to your life, yourself in many ways? So we talk about the 3 stages of kind of reflection, but it always starts with like, in what way does the media shape the way that you see yourselves and others? Um, and nobody ever thinks like they're influenced by the media. We all think like, oh, we're too strong for that. But research is overwhelmingly shows that, of course, it influences the way we see ourselves and others. And so, for boys and the students that we work with, and sometimes it's girls as well for some of the program development work that we've done, it really is helping them become more media literate. Like, how do you analyze the media messages and understand like who's creating it, to what purpose are they creating it, what are the values that are embedded in that media message,
Mhm.
um, and to have them think more critically about the media that they consume, and not take for granted this stuff. If you look at, I don't know if your kids have played Fortnite at all, but
Yes.
like, right, like, and so like you look at Fortnite and the way even like the characters, like the male characters are these jacked dudes, and the female characters are always like showing like a fair amount of skin and have giant breasts and tiny waists and tight butts, and and there's any number of these games out there where the genders are in really stereotypical ways, where the women are portrayed as objects and the men are jacked. and helping the students just understand why that is, like who created this and why are they creating it this way? And does this reflect reality in many ways? Early on when I did research, I visited the Boys and Girls Club in Mattapan. They have a teen center there. And, you know, incredible people, the Boys and Girls Club of Boston, and they were super gracious to me and helpful to me in the early stages of this to just do some research and to figure this out. And I met with this kid there, and we were talking about Instagram. This kid's maybe like 7th grade. And, you know, he's a little chunky. He's still got a fair amount of baby fat on him. And we're talking about Instagram. I was like, have you ever been on Insta and you look at things that are out there and you think, this is not helping me? This is hurting me. And it's a little bit of an abstract, you know, question. He's like, yeah, like there's this girl that I would love to get with from school. And I'm checking out her Insta and she's got these pictures of these dudes who are jacked. And they're like, you know, 6-pack abs and this. And he's like, look at me. He's like, I can't do that. Like, it's going to take me way too much work to get to that. And I don't want to have to do that many sit-ups, which is hilarious. But I was like, yeah, like, you don't have to. Like, you're fantastic. Like, you know, nothing wrong with being healthy. Like, nothing wrong with being fit, but not for that reason, right? Like, if that's the thing that's driving you, then, you know, there's better ways to be fit. And so there's an awareness of it when you call attention to it. And I think there just needs to be more purposeful efforts to call students' attention to the media that they consume and the way that it influences them, for better and for worse.
Yeah, because I mean, it is like a lot of these images are all they're all rested in the asserting dominance, right? You know, physical dominance and it's actually probably not mental or emotional dominance. It's probably just physical dominance. And I feel like that's really where a lot of the images come from.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, right? So I think, you know, media is so diverse, right? And so, you know, one of the things that we talk about is, you know, when people talk about the media, like, let's break it down. Like, you can't compare the news media to, you know, YouTube videos, right? Of, you know, skater kids or whatever. But yeah, I think in video games, particularly, especially as like first-person shooter games or whatever the hell, you know, it is, you know, it really is like, course, like that's the purpose of the game is domination. Right. And you know, a lot of sports, like there's, you know, if you think about football or a lot of like contact sports, it's that. And I grew up playing sports. I went to college on a sports scholarship. It was a lot of a big part of my life and spending a lot of time in locker rooms. And but in terms of the way that you think about TV shows and movies and the way that guys handle their problems, it's often reflected through violence, and it's often reflected through, you know, the emotion that men are able to show. And men are really emotional in media. The emotion just tends to be rage. Like, that's the emotion that they're showing, like anger and rage. And, you know, one of the last classes I taught at Curry was a class on superheroes. And so it was a capstone course in which superheroes were the common focal point. And then we got into like sociology and psychology. And so, you know, is Batman like a psychotic? And we kind of got into like broad things and understanding things around gender through the lens of Wonder Woman, or the way that female superheroes are portrayed, you know, identity, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of this was basically like, you know, men show a lot of emotion. It just tends to be aggressive emotion, as opposed to being open, allowing themselves to be open. And it's getting better, and it's getting better for a lot of reasons, but helping boys understand that they're allowed to have a full spectrum of emotions is a good starting point.
Yeah, so I want to talk more about Boys for the Better and how you've grown it and how it's impacted you, you know, sort of your experience in that. I want to make one side note about Wonder Woman, and then I want to talk about Veterans Legal Services, where you're now the Director of Communications and Development, because I do think that so much of the way that we teach boys how they should be has affected our veterans community, the male veteran community, in terms of just PTSD and being able to talk about emotions, and then sort of where they end up in these places where they are in unstable environments because they haven't been able to deal with and live with the emotions that they've experienced. So I want to talk about that and sort of ask if there's corollaries. But I do
Mhm.
want to make a side note about Wonder Woman. I love Wonder Woman. I grew up loving Wonder Woman, her
Yeah.
little invisible plane, and the lasso of truth and all of that stuff. And then I love the Wonder Woman movie, and then I watched Wonder Woman 1984, and my takeaway from that movie was rage. First of all, the movie was just terrible. I think it's pretty much like
Yeah.
universally been panned. But my takeaway from the movie was, okay, so you can't be a strong, successful woman with a career and have a love life? Like, she had to give up one to have the other. I was so frustrated that that was the end of the movie, was that she had to say goodbye to him because having the love life, having the full emotional heart was sapping her strength. Like, why's it gotta be that way?
Yeah.
Male
Yeah.
they do it to a female character.
Yeah, that is true. And I think like the fact that she was spent like 50 years or something like pining over this guy, like that just seemed a little absurd. But narrative is narrative. But yeah, we have like in our basement, who speaks to like superhero nerd, and I got my older daughter into it. I've taken like to the Boston like Comic-Con convention. I took my younger one there, and we have pictures of her with like somebody, the folks who dress up. So like I have this great framed picture of my little one with Squirrel Girl. And it's like, it's awesome. And in our basement, we actually have these like poster, like comic book covers that have been like posterized all over our basement. And, we have a Wonder Woman one, and we talk a lot about that. But yeah, they tend to be portrayed as lame in general, and even like now, and to geek out a little bit further, like if you watch like Disney and they have like the new WandaVision show, so I don't know to what degree you watch this stuff.
I watched the first couple episodes. I haven't
Right,
watched
so
the
like Scarlet Witch, and she became, it fell in love with Vision, who is this like non-humanoid guy, and he was killed by Thanos. And basically, like, she just had a mental breakdown. Like, she just lost it, and she's created this alternative universe. I don't know that would have been the narrative framework that Marvel would use for a male character in any way. If somebody went off the deep end, like, and if you go back to like the Avengers movie, like Hawkeye, his family disappeared. He went off the deep end and went really violent. Like, he just started like assassinating bad people. In this case, she's lost somebody she cares about, and she's just falling apart emotionally in a really different way. And so the way that the entertainment media is framing the two genders and the way that they express despair says something and tells our children something about what's socially acceptable for them.
it sets expectations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about the Veterans Legal Services and the work that you're doing there. So as you're building Boys for the Better, I'm interested in sort of how you've been growing it, what it's been, and why you've taken on this other job.
Yeah, well, so COVID was a big influence. So once in March of 2020, once COVID really just shut down schools, it shut down the functioning of our programming, because we were doing all of our work directly in schools. And so we were at the Thurgood Marshall Middle School in Lynn. We were doing some work in Newton. We were doing some work in Boston, Cambridge, and everything just shut down. And we're an early stage organization. The plan had always been, we're going to digitize curriculum. We're going to make this about professional development. So we're going to teach the teacher and hand over the curriculum for teachers to run where they saw it best. But we just weren't there yet. And so when COVID happened and schools really stopped in many ways and just had to get going on digital, we just had to pull back. And so to some degree, we had to put Boys for the Better in this kind of induced coma. To some degree, we were still doing work. Where I'm doing work in Cambridge now with the Department of Public Health on this domestic violence prevention program, specifically targeted to men. And so, how do you get more men, particularly in the younger ages, so late teens, early 20s, to engage in the work of domestic violence prevention? but it required us to kind of pull back and to see, what was going to happen, because even in September, when school started again, it was all that they could do to just teach, math and English, like as they were trying to figure out the digital space. And so they just did not have the bandwidth, no pun intended, to do anything else. So the opportunity of Veterans Legal Services came about. I have long been passionate about civil legal aid. Sixth Amendment of the Constitution is essentially the right to a fair trial, but embedded within that is a right to an attorney in criminal cases. And the understanding was that the legal system is just too complex for somebody to receive justice if you don't have an attorney. And so if you can't afford an attorney will be provided to you. That's in criminal cases. In civil cases, you don't have that constitutional right. And so if you're dealing with foreclosure or an eviction, and you're battling a bank that has lawyers, or a landlord that has obviously the means for a lawyer, like, you don't have access, you don't have a legal right to an attorney. And if you don't have the money, to get one, you don't have it. Domestic violence, like if you need a protective order from your partner, that's a civil issue. And if you have to go to court and figure out how to navigate that, like, you don't have a legal right. One's not given to you. And, there's any number of cases, child custody, et cetera, there are civil issues. As we've talked about, we have this connection through service, national service. Service takes the form of a lot of ways, and military service is this really unique space where, somebody who serves in AmeriCorps or Peace Corps, rarely comes back from their service broken because of their service. Among our veteran population, there's a sizable number who come back broken, whether it's physically or mentally. And, quite often they need help. But again, they need access to the help. And so that's where I was drawn to Veterans Legal Services. I had spent some time, I lived in DC for about 10 years, and so worked for a legal aid organization there called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And it specifically provided civil legal aid to journalists, news organizations, documentary filmmakers who needed help in libel cases, needed help in, when the government was restricting access to things. And so that was my first taste of it through the prism of media. I've always just really appreciated and respected attorneys. I'm not an attorney, so my area is, PhD in media studies, but I really respect what lawyers do and how they use storytelling, because a big part of the law is, how do you tell a story? How do you gather the facts? How do you put together a narrative that persuades somebody? So I always felt a little bit of a kinship with attorneys. I like the way they think, and way they act, for some greater purpose beyond themselves. So that's how I ended up with Veterans Legal Services. It's an amazing organization. We work throughout the entire state of Massachusetts. So that's one of the benefits of kind of the shutdown that happened in society, where everything had to go remote. Veterans Legal Services had to change their operating model and started creating telelegal services back in March. And so it's allowed us to reach veterans in the western part of Massachusetts, which frankly, if you're out in Springfield, you might as well be in a different state to some degree. We're able to reach folks in the Cape and the islands, in the upper part of the North Shore. And so we serve about 700 veterans a year. We just actually launched a 5-year strategic plan to double that reach throughout the state. And these are, veterans of modest means, who live in Massachusetts, who have legal needs, that, we can really make a positive impact and help them lower the stress level in their lives. I think that's kind of a common thread for the diversity of cases, whether it's housing stabilization or access to VA services or whatever. It allows them to stabilize their lives and live a dignified existence that we would want for anybody.
So in each of the jobs you've had, you've been basically you've been telling people other people's stories, right? That's sort of the
Yeah,
theme that we
yeah.
have here. Um, so it's interesting because as a professor, as a journalist, as the first head of communications and development for Veterans Legal Services, you are acting as that journalist. You're telling someone else's story.
Mhm. Yeah.
When you were Boys for the Better, you were telling the story of boys, but you had to be the one. It had to be all about you. Was it a shift for you to be the one center stage where you were talking about you and why you were doing this and why it mattered? Or did you just see it still as just telling someone else's story? So was it the same muscle?
Yeah, I still looked outwardly, and whether that was not wanting to talk about myself, the truth is, like, I didn't feel like I had this like amazing personal story to tell. Like, I certainly weaved elements of myself in. I always mentioned that I'm the father of two daughters because I think that's to some degree novel. That here's a person who's
Yes.
working to um, work with boys. So I spent all my time thinking about trying to help boys, and then in my house I'm surrounded by girls and women. My dog's even a girl. Like, literally, like, everybody in my universe here is a girl. But I think to get people to understand the importance and the largeness of the issue is to look beyond me. And so I know there are folks in the healthy masculinity space who have a really interesting narrative about their own development, and they slept with a gazillion people, and they were trash, and they this and that. That just, I didn't feel like that was something that is particularly persuasive when you're talking to educators about why this is necessary, why we need to engage young boys, why we need to help our coaches and our guidance counselors and parents understand the media world. I think media is one of those unique things where everybody has a connection to it. Like,
Mm.
absolutely everybody has a connection to it. And so helping people understand the way that they connect to media and getting them to take a step back and understanding the good, the bad, and the ugly of that, I think, to me, that's far more persuasive than anything that's uniquely about me. To make it about me, to some degree, would be an exercise in vanity, and I don't think that serves the goal, in any way.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I've always said that, we do better when we create institutions of long-term change rather than cathedrals to ourselves. And
good line. Yeah, good
I
line.
think but it's so tempting. It's so tempting because you start
Yeah.
something and then you get praised for it, and people are like, "Oh, you're so smart, you're so great, tell me more." And I think we see a lot of people who start things run into that problem. So,
But
last
I'd also
question.
say to that point too is, like, that's the challenging pivot point for a lot of this stuff. Is a lot of startups are built around the cult of personality of the founder, and for an organization to mature, it has to get away from that. And I think that is one of the trickier things, is that for an organization to go beyond the founder and to really center on the mission really requires a thoughtful approach. And I've seen it. My doctoral research was around organizational change at mission-driven organizations. And so, having come from the news world, it was this: how do you get this where there's this divide between the people who deliver the mission, i.e., the journalists, and the people who are in charge of the business, the publishers, the advertising people. And you can look at that same dichotomy in higher ed. So the
Mhm.
professors versus the people who are in charge of the money. You can look at it in hospitals, the doctors and nurses versus the admin. And so, how do you make change happen in a place where there tends to be shared governance to some degree, but there's a real divide between those who are there specifically because they're dedicated to the mission and those who are responsible for the money. And I think for any organization to grow, there has to be an awareness of how the money's made, how the revenue is generated, while staying true to the mission. So even now at VLS, like, I take every opportunity to tell the staff about, like, where's the money coming from, and
Mhm.
how the money is being. We're largely reliant on fundraising and development, and so like, I'm not expecting staff attorneys to go out there and sell the organization, but I absolutely want them to think about there's really interesting stories of veterans that we serve that can be told, and that is a way for us to engage our partners. So I do think as much as you can divorce the founder's identity to some degree to the broader mission, the organization will thrive.
I think that's absolutely incredible learning. So, just with a couple minutes that we have left, tell me, in the last couple of years, sort of becoming an entrepreneur, a mission-driven entrepreneur, and going through COVID, what's the biggest lesson? What's the biggest surprise that you've had? What's the learning you weren't expecting?
I think it's the best laid plans can be blown up. I really think that's, to me, the great, like, created this from scratch, put together an amazing, group of people from a board of directors and lots of, folks supporting me. Like, one of the most amazing things around starting Boys for the Better were the incredible people I got to talk to as I was developing it. Like, I talked to some amazing people who have done amazing work, who are so inspiring. And I loved that, because otherwise, like, I would never have had the reason to talk to those people about those things. And so that really was a blessing.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, like, this, crazy pandemic happened, and so, you got to think about how can you pivot. And in some cases, we've seen, like, so many businesses have not been able to survive this and have gone under. And it's tragic, but I think a lot of those, will come back in some form or another, because the people who created it, if they still have the, energy to do so. And as you know, like, creating your own thing just takes a tremendous amount of energy. But I think one of the great learning things is that there's always that curveball that is going to throw you. And, can you stay true to what motivates you? For me, pivoting to the work of Veterans Legal Services is true to who I am and what I want to do to make the world a better place. It's in a slightly different area. It's connected, as you well said, around the work that I do. But I think staying true to yourself and figuring it out, and knowing that, like, things happen, and, it's not a reflection of how hard you're working per se. It's things happen, and just keep moving towards what you care about and your North Star, and don't be scared of making the change. And sometimes you need permission from your 12-year-old daughter to do it, but it's okay. It's all right. Go do it.
Oh, I'm sure your 12-year-old daughter, she's obviously not 12 anymore, but 14 is
Almost
very
14.
is very proud of you. And I'm proud to be your friend. I have
Thank
had
you.
on the scroll below ways that people can find you, but for anyone who's just listening to this later on a podcast, tell people where they can find out more about you, about Boys for the Better, about Veterans Legal Services.
Thank you. So Boys for the Better is boysforthebetter.org. You can learn more about us there. Currently doing a program in Brookline. So a virtual program in Brookline for over 25 middle school boys there. We're doing some work in Cambridge as well right now. And veteranslegalservices.org. You can check us out there. We're doing incredible work throughout the state. It's an incredible staff. We are an organization led by 2 women, which is unto itself really unique in the veterans space. We serve a real diverse population. I think something like 45% of the veterans that we're serving are people of color or women. Where in Massachusetts, there isn't a lot of diversity in the veteran community. And so, we're serving a population that needs attention. And check us out. We're excited to bring more people into the fold, supporting the work that we're doing to help veterans in Massachusetts.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Jeff Lemberg, for being with us today on
Thank you.
the first episode of season 2 of LGOtv Big Talk. It was great to start my morning with you.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.